All right, so now that we've finished our look at Boethius and saw him as sort of being the architect of the Middle Ages, I wanted to take a few moments to look at later medieval thought. And so as we've seen, Boethius's influence is going to be felt for many centuries afterwards. Around the time that Boethius is put to death is considered the official end of the Roman Empire. But after the Dark Ages, Europe begins to rebuild. And when it does so, it rebuilds largely upon the intellectual design that was left by Boethius. Boethius, as I mentioned before, left us not only the consolation of philosophy, but he translated the logical writings of Aristotle. He is responsible for writing logic textbooks. He writes a number of commentaries and other works, and he also lays out the basis for what the medieval university is going to look like by establishing, as we saw before, the concept of the trivium and the quadrivium, those basic classes that should be taken in these schools, and also the idea of the quadlibet, which is the test that is used to move from one level to the next in the medieval university. Boethius's writings survived. They reintroduced logic and philosophy to the Western world after the Dark Ages. And as we also saw, his consolation of philosophy served as a guide for many people, including King Alfred, Chaucer, and Queen Elizabeth I. But in the aftermath of this, of course, there's a lot of other theories and ideas that come into being. And one of the most important concepts of the later medieval period is what's known as the problem of universals. Now, the universals are essentially what the ancient Greeks called the forms. And so these universals were these abstract, eternal concepts that did not have physical existence or physical reality. Throughout so much of our history, from the ancient Greeks onwards, we had two basic views of this, both of which were called realism, because they accepted that the forms or the universals were real. We have the extreme view of realism, which is what Plato gives us. This is also the view of Augustine, and that is that universals exist as a mind-independent entity in a realm of their own. So, as an extreme realist, you believe that this world is poor copies, attempts to picture that ultimate form. But the reality of things is that other realm of existence. That is what is real. And so that's the extreme realist view. The moderate view is that of Aristotle, and this is also the view that Boethius takes, which is to say that universals exist as mind-independent entities, but within particulars. So just as we saw when we looked at Aristotle's theory of the forms, the universals themselves, or the forms, they are real. They are the absolute truth that we seek. But rather than existing in some other realm up there, they exist within the objects in this world. And so if we use the concept of a table, for the extreme realist, that would be a table for the simple reason that it tries to emulate that perfect form of tableness that dwells in that other realm, in that other place. If you are a moderate realist, then you would believe that the form dwells inside of the table, and that's why it's a table. The form or the universal acts like our modern concept of DNA, and so it gives it its form, its shape, its texture, its color, and all of the things that make it what it is. But it exists within this world. But both of those recognize the idea of realism. But this is going to change as we move into the 1100s, 1200s. We come to a view that's now known as anti-realism, because these views will reject the idea that there are universals or forms. Now, in essence, the anti-realist perspective is basically they're really the same, but one sounds more hardcore than the other. We'll put it that way. On the one hand, we have what's called conceptualism, and this is put forth by John Duns Scotus. And he says that universals exist only as mind-dependent entities. So what that means is that the concepts like tableness, humanness, they don't really exist. There is no reality to them, but we use them. They are social constructs. They are words that we have created to be able to communicate with each other. And so their existence depends upon the human mind to understand it, to use it. The more hardcore position is that of nominalism, which is put forth by people such as Roscelin and William of Ockham. And that is to state outright that universals simply do not exist, that the only thing that is real are particulars. So using our example of the table, like I said, if you were an extreme realist, you would say that that's a table because it's trying to emulate that perfect form that dwells in that other realm. If you are a moderate realist, you would say that that is a table because the form of tableness dwells inside it and makes it what it is. But if you are an anti-realist, you're going to say that that is a table simply because I speak English and for no other reason. Long ago, we decided that things that were elevated off the ground, had a flat surface we could sit things on, we're going to call those tables. But that's all that a table is. It's words and nothing more than that. Looking at a few of these figures, John Duns Scotus, John of Scotland, was born 1265 to 1308. Obviously from Scotland, and he put forth this conceptualist view, which basically says that we can draw what he calls a formal distinction. The idea that a distinction can be made for clarity or for explanatory purposes, but it can't actually be made in reality, because if you were to take the form and the matter and separate them from each other, you would ultimately have nothing left, right? We have to have both for existence to be there. In terms of the formal distinction, Duns Scotus said that we have two things. We have a common nature, which is the universal, and we have a haeseity, which is a thisness, which is the particular. And so in the case of Socrates, the common nature would be his humanness, his humanity, that which he shares with all of humankind. And the haeseity, which is his particular nature, which we're calling his Socratiety, all of those things that Socrates has that makes him Socrates and no one else. Now, many things share the common nature. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they all share the universal humanity, but each one has a particular haeseity that makes them uniquely them. Duns Scotus's point was that we can talk about these two things distinctly so that we can talk about them for clarity purposes, but we can't actually separate them. Because if we took all of the attributes that make up Socrates away, there'd be nothing there. And likewise, if we had no humanity, no human form for it to dwell in, then there would be nothing there. And so both of these elements need to mingle together. Now, I have always felt that even though people consider Duns Scotus to be a conceptualist, an anti-realist, I've always considered that his view is very much in line with the moderate realist view, because it seems to imply that the humanity or the universal nature exists just within the object, within the particular body of this world. But Duns Scotus is considered a conceptualist by many people because of the nature of the fact that if you separate or pulled apart these two things, whatever that is would cease to exist. You know, a real realist would recognize the reality of the form or the universal. And so it could exist apart from the common entities of it, whether that be in another realm or whatever. And Duns Scotus does not believe that that is the case. So that's why he's considered to be part of this anti-realist perspective. The more interesting characters are those that advocate the view of nominalism, that there are no universals whatsoever, that the only thing there are particulars. Now, this view was actually, as far as I can tell, first put forward by an individual called Eric of Auxerre, who lived from 841 to 876, so very early in the medieval period, shortly after things started opening up. The school of Auxerre was a very important school during the Middle Ages in France, and Eric was the headmaster of that school, and he began promoting this view, this idea that only particulars exist, this idea that a table is only a table because we speak the language in which we're going to call it that, but words are nothing more than the social construct that we use to be able to communicate. The reality is the particular things of the world, and this table is different from that table, is different from every other table in existence. Now, Eric was very careful to keep his views within the confines of the school, which means that it didn't really catch on during his lifetime, because his successor, Remigius of Auxerre, is going to be an old school realist, and he will simply take the school back towards that line of thinking. And so it's Roscelin of Compania, who lives from 1050 to 1125 roughly. He is the one who is given the credit really for being the founding figure of nominalism. Roscelin was a small-time cleric basically in Compania, but he began teaching these concepts, these ideas. Now, what is going to make him stand out is the fact that there are individuals who are going to object to this view. Most notably, Anselm, who we spoke about before as the one giving us that ontological proof for the existence of God. Anselm, on 2 separate occasions, is going to bring Roscelin up on charges for what's called tritheism. Tritheism is the idea that there are 3 gods as opposed to 1. Now, where does he get this idea? That's really a good question, because Roscelin doesn't talk about religious matters really at all. He is, like Eric before him, really keeping this in the realm of logic, in the realm of reason. But as a top-notch church official, Anselm was very concerned that if we followed this view of nominalism, because Christianity had been based upon Plato, if we follow this concept of nominalism, it could lead into heresy, because if there are no direct links or connections between things, only the particular entities, then that means that the Trinity cannot be one entity. It has to be 3, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so this is heresy. Anselm brings Roscelin up on charges of this, but Roscelin understands how to play the system, and he gives Anselm what he wants. He says, I apologize for this. I didn't realize that my theory could be taken this way. It was certainly not my intention to do so. You want to burn my writings, please go ahead and do so. And that's exactly what happened. Roscelin sat still for 6 months, a year, and then he writes everything up again and begins teaching it all over, which is why he's brought up on charges twice. The second time, he does exactly the same thing in front of Anselm. Anselm lets him go. Again, he writes everything up again, begins teaching it all over. By this point, Anselm is gone, but another monk is going to come forward, Bernard, and he's going to bring these charges. So 3 separate occasions, Roscelin is charged with this. 3 separate occasions, he gives them what they want, but then continues to teach the concept, continues to teach the idea. Now, unfortunately for us, when this happens the 3rd time, it's not too much longer before Roscelin is going to die himself. And so, most of what we now know about Roscelin comes from these charges against him, comes from the people who spoke in opposition to him. But in essence, Roscelin left us almost nothing in his own hand. All we have that can directly be attributed to him is a roughly 20-page letter that was written to Abelard. And that's it. So we know mostly about him from his dissenters. But we do know that while it's unlikely that he held any religious convictions that would have led to tritheism, that he did firmly believe in the idea of nominalism. And he is going to become basically famous for saying that words are flatum vocus, basically vocal flatulence. It's a farting out of the mouth. There's no substance to them. There's no reality to them. There's no validity to them. They are simply puffs of air that have no substance or meaning whatsoever until we choose to put meaning to them. The idea of table has no meaning whatsoever until my mind chooses to link that word with a particular thing that exists in this world. And we could have very easily chosen any word to symbolize that. There's nothing innate or inherent within the word table that makes a table a table. And so the words are flatum vocus. They are puffs of air and nothing more. Now, those who followed in Roscelin's footsteps, and there were many, found themselves running into the same problems until we come to William of Ockham. William of Ockham lives from 1290 to 1349. He is born in or around the town of Ockham in England. We know that he attended Oxford University and that he taught there for at least 1 year, promoting the idea of nominalism. And Ockham, just like Roscelin and those who came before him, is going to be brought up on charges of heresy. This charge of tritheism keeps popping its head. But unlike Roscelin, Ockham was a very arrogant individual, and he believed firmly in what he was saying, doing, teaching. And so he fought this charge, and he continued to fight it for 4 years until he was standing in front of the Pope. And he says to the Pope that on this issue, I am right and you are wrong. Now, as you can imagine, that is not going to go over very well in a tradition that believes in papal infallibility. So Ockham is excommunicated from the church, which could have been a horrible thing for him, because once a person is excommunicated, of course, if you believe in the religious tradition, then that implies that he is condemned to hellfire throughout all eternity. But on a more pragmatic level, it also meant that within the law, you had very little rights, very little protection. You were going to be a pariah within society for the rest of your life. But fortunately for him, he found a champion who is going to bring him into his court and give him the freedom to write, to teach, to do pretty much anything that he wants to do without having to worry about the Catholic censors. And so through this process, Ockham is going to cement the nominalist view as the default position. The idea that universals are linguistic constructs designed to aid in communication, and that they only occur because of language. One of Ockham's quotes that I really love, he says, "We create a cloud of dust and then complain we cannot see." We talk about the difficulty of communication and understanding each other, but yet we are the ones that complicated things by developing a language in the first place. Animals recognize reality without language, which means that they are probably closer to reality than what we are. That table we keep talking about, a dog is going to come by and it's going to register that there's something there. It's not going to link a word to it and say, oh, that's a table. but it's going to register there's something there, and it's going to interact with that table to jump over it or on top of it or go around it or whatever. But it recognizes the reality of something there without being clouded by the language that we have created that distances ourselves and pushes us away from that table. Ockham says we need to look at the way that we as individuals develop language in the first place. And he's going to give us two basic concepts. One is intention, the other is imposition. Now, intention refers to mental signs. And there's two stages here, first and second. First intention is the mental concept received without reference to language. This is our first step. We don't realize it because our mind makes these links so quickly. But just like the animal, we get a mental picture of what we're looking at in the world, and that comes into our mind. That is first intention, simply seeing the thing. And so the lady that's sitting there, she's seeing the cat without drawing any words to associate it. It's just the vision of that thing. And if there were another cat or a dog or anything else, they would get that same image. So that's first intention, without any reference to language, just the mental concept, the mental idea of cat, table, whatever coming into the mind. Second intention is when the mental concept conjures the verbal concept. In other words, we use the word to conceptualize the mental concept. Because having grown up in this particular culture, we learn to play a particular language game. And so instantaneously, as soon as I see the cat, my mind has already picked out that word, and I can apply that word to it. Cat, or table, or tree, human, whatever. But that mind picks out that concept and applies it to the object. That's intention. Imposition means imposing a name on an object, giving a word significance. And again, there's two stages, first and second. Now, keep in mind that imposition will be the first stage that we come to when we're naming a new thing. But once it's already established within our minds, within our cultures, what these words are, then it comes as a later part of the process. First imposition is using the word to refer to the physical thing. So I look at this thing that's sitting here, and my mind gets the mental picture of it. That's the first intention. My mind picks out the word cat. That's the second intention. And then I use the word to refer to that physical thing. So I may say to somebody, look at that cat, or why is the cat in the mailbox? And so that word is being applied to refer to the thing in the world. It's being used as a form of communication. Second imposition is going to come much later, when we begin to refer to words rather than physical things. Once language has taken root, sometimes we'll have a need to talk about the language itself and not just the words, and not just the objects, rather. And so if instead of talking about the furry thing in the mailbox, I wanted to talk about the word cat, that would be second imposition. And normally we know we're talking about second imposition, we're talking about the word, because you'll see parentheses around the word. And so you see the two phrases there. Cat has 3 letters, and then cat with the parentheses around it has 3 letters. The first, cat has 3 letters without the quotation marks. If I were to say that, that's an ungrammatical statement, because unless the cat has been down to the letterbox and picked up your post for you, it's unlikely that the cat has 3 letters. But if I have cat has 3 letters with the quotation marks around cat, then I know I'm talking about the word. Now it's a grammatical statement. Cat has 3 letters, C-A-T, there they are, 1, 2, 3. And so this is the process, according to Ockham, by which we are able to acquire knowledge. That's how language develops over the course of time. One of the key things that William of Ockham is best known for is what's called Occam's razor. More specifically, it's referred to as the principle of economy, which says that entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. In other words, all things being equal, we should always use the simpler theory. So the idea of the principle of economy, or Occam's razor, and it's called Occam's razor because it allows you to shave away all the excess, all the things that you probably don't really need. It tells us that the simplest solution is usually right. There's no need to complicate things if you don't have to. Now, if a more complicated theory is going to give you a better picture of the world, then there's a reason for it. But all things being equal, why choose the more complex theory? Take the simpler one. That being the case, nominalism and realism are both able to allow for communication. But nominalism has fewer entities, thus making it simpler. The example that Occam gives, everybody likes to go back to Socrates. All right, so let's take the figure of Socrates. If I want to make the statement, Socrates is white, from the standpoint of a realist, I need many different entities there. I need, yes, the physical person standing there, but I also need, at the very least, the concept of humanness or humanity. I need the concept of white or whiteness. I need the concept of a Socrates, for that matter, not to mention going into all the attributes that apply to him. And so I can understand the statement Socrates is white using realism, but it requires an awful lot of these added entities. On the other hand, if I look at it from the standpoint of nominalism, all I need is that one person standing there, because the name Socrates is simply a word that applies to him. The term white is simply a word that is predicated of him. And so, since these concepts are nothing more than words, the nominalist view is simpler. And so this is why we should accept it. And eventually, nominalism does become our accepted view. It becomes sort of the standard response. I mean, without discussing any of this, if I were to ask you why a table is a table, I think more of you would say it's a table because that's what we chose to call it, rather than it's a table because there's some tableness floating around in space somewhere that we have to try to emulate. So it's really become our default position over the course of time. Just as Boethius was a transitional figure between the ancient and the medieval world, Occam is going to be a transitional figure between the medieval and the modern world. Occam is going to move us away from the invisible realms and towards the physical world. One of the things that we find from Occam, even though the term empiricist will not be coined for a few hundred more years, Occam really was an empiricist, which means that he believes that our knowledge comes from observation, from experimentation, from trial and error. Okay? People like Plato would imagine that all knowledge resides solely within the mind, and that it's a matter of working the human mind to develop an understanding of the world. If I were to lock myself in a room with a certain few pieces of evidence, I should be able to create knowledge based upon that. But from the standpoint of an empiricist, Occam would disagree. Knowledge means that I'm looking at the world around me. Much like a scientist, I am developing a hypothesis. I'm testing that hypothesis to see if it holds true. And in that process, through experimentation, I am gaining knowledge. But of course, we have to remember that any knowledge that is gained in this process is always subject to revision. And that's an important factor that we'll need to look at in the next lecture. The last thing I wanted to mention with regards to Ockham, and specifically his ideal of empiricism, is that about 500 years after the time of Ockham, there is a Scottish philosopher called David Hume. And David Hume is going to become considered by most the most prominent example, the great culmination of empiricism. But actually, William of Ockham said almost everything that Hume is going to get credit for about 500 years before him. And one of the key things that they both talked about is this idea of causality. We know that the universe that we live in is contingent because it comes from God's free will. There's nothing that is established. There's nothing that's absolute. Remember how Boethius talked about the farmer finding the cache of coins and maybe thinking that it was a matter of fate, but it isn't. This is a series of choices that were made by people that led to that. And so this is causality. One thing led to another, led to another. It's impossible for us to rationalize the world, so we must observe it in a causal order. Knowledge is largely inductive, but this type of knowledge could be wrong. So it is a good idea to have a healthy skepticism. You notice the person releasing the pen. And so in terms of causality, I am going to say that the release of the pen is the cause of the pen falling. And that makes perfect sense. But how do I know this to be the case? How do I know that if I release a pen, it's going to fall? Because I've seen it happen in the past. I've seen it happen thousands of times in the past. And the more times that we see things occur, the more we build up an expectation that it's always going to work that way. But here's the problem. There is no logical reason for us to believe that the future has to resemble the past. Many times it does, and it's a technique that we use for gaining knowledge, but because the future is contingent and unwritten, there's no guarantee that the future is going to look like the past. And so the possibility exists that at some point in the future, maybe I release the pen and it doesn't fall. Maybe it floats in midair. Maybe it shifts to the side. Maybe it rises upwards. Okay? It doesn't seem very likely that that's going to happen, but the possibility is there because something could alter or change within the universe that led to that change. And so this is why he says skepticism is an important tool of knowledge. If we remain skeptical, we're open to the fact that the knowledge we possess may not be absolute knowledge. That the knowledge that we're trying to acquire may be something that just works here and now, but we may discover that we need to alter or change that knowledge later in the future. And so skepticism becomes a crucial tool for our understanding of the world that we live in, because not only does it leave us open to that possibility that we could be wrong, but it also makes us constantly question what we know, and that propels us to further gain more knowledge and more knowledge and more knowledge. If we didn't have this skepticism, then we would probably stagnate where we are. But the skepticism pushes us forwards. And so it's perceived as a good thing. And that is a standard view amongst the empiricists. We'll see in the next lecture, where I introduce you to René Descartes, that this is not going to be the case for a group of people called rationalists.